Good morning, guys, and welcome back to the Hidebound Convivium. It is currently May 14th, 2021, and today's topic will be the descent of science fiction. I know you guys are tired of hearing me rant about science fiction, but you're going to have to hear it again because I've got more thoughts on the subject. As some of you may have noticed, I've got a lot of free time, and that's not a good thing. I just recently graduated, so I'm in between jobs at the moment because my employment was tied to the university. So yes, I have found myself in possession of a lot of free time that I would like not to have. But in the interim, perhaps we can have some good conversations and start up a little bit of discussion on what I think are these important cultural topics. So today's topic, as the title of the video will alert you to, is the descent of science fiction, and I guess I could subtitle this: "Why Science Fiction Has Heretofore Not Been Paused." Um, so I want to take a look at just sort of a general trend in specifically space science fiction, space opera science fiction, and why we're seeing the changes that we are in the genre, and I think what it means and how it's reflective of a wider cultural shift. So, the question I might pose is that science fiction has always been a genre, at least space science fiction, has always been a genre that has attracted a kind of, um, well, to put it bluntly, it attracts a kind of shit libby sort of personality. I think there's no better sort of example of this than Isaac Asimov. I went around hunting for things that Asimov said to sort of illustrate my point, and I came across this quote that he apparently wrote, or a commentary that he wrote at one point on a children's lullaby. I think it's a children's lullaby, but there's an old song that goes, "Tell me why the stars do shine. Tell me why the ivy twines. Tell me what makes skies so blue, and I'll tell you why I love you." And then he pithily retorts, "Nuclear fusion makes stars to shine, and tropisms make the ivy twine. Raleigh scattering makes skies so blue, and testicular hormones are why I love you," which you should never put on your Valentine's Day card. But I think it kind of illustrates the sort of person that we're talking about, right? Is Asimov is definitely not like a conservative, like a man of the right. At the same time, if you ever read any of his science fiction, like yeah, you get you get the materialism and atheism of his worldview kind of bleeds in, and that's understandable. But it's not really what we would consider to be paused, or his settings don't aspire to luxury gay space communism, or luxury fully automated gay space communism, right? The Foundation series and even some of the robot stories, right? The space travel is still regarded in this kind of exploratory frontier pioneer sort of complex, and that's generally how space exploration was understood in early science fiction. A great example is Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles stories, which literally portray the colonization of Mars as the colonization of the Western United States, the Western frontier, complete with Martians as Indians and all that sort of thing. So, it's clear that even though these science fiction writers are not sort of culturally conservative, for example, they don't have the same kinds of preoccupations as modern science fiction writers. And even in more modern examples, you can see this evolution in real time. And so, to give another example, right? I believe it's two gentlemen that write under one name, but there's the James S.A. Corey Expanse novels. And in those novels, there's a character named Kamina Drummer. And in the books, she is married and has a husband, I believe. I've never read the books, but I've seen the television show. And in the television show, this is kind of jarring because it just kind of comes out of nowhere. She's like the captain of a polyamorous. She's a captain of a spaceship who also happens to be crewed by a polyamorous um, relationship, and you just kind of look at that and go, why? Like, it just, which I mean, the in general, it's a very paused show with things like that, but that in particular I just kind of scratched my head a little bit, and I think you're gonna tend to see that sort of even more. I mean, Star Trek is a fantastic example of this, right? Where just Star Trek is kind of like a barometer of where our sort of progressive neoliberal utopianism is headed next. Um, and the first Star Trek was kind of like that, and then it just continues to go on. It doesn't mean it's bad. It's just that's sort of what's baked into the cake of Star Trek. And, Star Trek's sort of later 20th century science fiction, and into today. I haven't seen any of the recent movies because just know. Um, but you compare this, right, to sort of earlier science fiction with it doesn't have like culturally conservative sort of preoccupations. Maybe you could argue Heinlein, but not really. Um, a- and then you see how that's drifted over time. And I think for me at least, it makes a lot less compelling and a lot less interesting and a lot less um, uh, it's just a lot less engaging to me as a reader or as a watcher of a television show or a movie. And I'm sitting here wondering why. Is it just me being a stodgy old conservative who can't deal with gay people on the screen, or is it about something else? And what I think what I think the problem is that modern science fiction writers increasingly are failing to understand what space is as a storytelling medium. So we'll talk a little bit about space, right? So space is kind of a mythic canvas. We want to talk about, what would X happen in space? Can you hear things in space? No. Would you be able to execute this like turn in space? Depends. And we sit and argue over like the minutia of space travel and how this would work and how that would work and yada yada yada. And fundamentally, when you get into a storytelling mode or storytelling aspect, that stuff should kind of fade to the background. And what you get is, what does space represent symbolically? And in the modern period, since the advent of rocketry and space travel, the sort of symbolic importance of space has kind of flipped almost in a way, um, between the sort of classical understanding. So in the Greek creation myth, you have Uranus, the sky, who comes down into Gaia, the who's sort of the primordial chaos, the unformed earth, and their union generates the Titans, the it generates the world and first the greatest of the gods, the first gods, so to speak. Um, and nowadays, since the advent of rocketry, at least, the script is kind of flipped. You might even argue since the revelation of Christianity, but I would say this takes on a more strong aspect since we actually have the capacity to go into space. Is that space now is the primordial chaos. Space is that untamed region where there are no forms, there is no order, and the Earth is the safe, settled, ordered garden. Earth is the Eden, and space is the chaos outside of the Eden. So when you have earlier science fiction, people are going out into space. They're going out to do the same sort of things, right, that Adam and Eve are doing when they leave Eden. They're taking an unformed, chaotic wilderness and they are trammeling it down. And there's a kind of there's a culture that goes along with pioneering frontiersmen, sort of people who trammel down the chaos of the wilderness. And what it really boils down to is there's a kind of fundamental virility to um, order coming into chaos and generating more order. It's kind of almost a sexual or a phallic act. Sorry to sorry to get that heavy this early in the morning, but in other words, it's a kind of it's a masculine act, really, and it's an outwardly directed masculine act to that replicates the sort of, in America specifically, and this is why science fiction I think was so space science fiction was so popular in the United States, was that we already have this well established and continuing narrative of frontier colonization settlement. And that's always an excuse me, that's always an outwardly directed and civilizing and ordering phenomenon where you're leaving yourself and going out and doing works in the world. And you juxtapose that with progressivism, and I would say progressivism, or the faction counterposed to conservatism, or traditionalism in the United States, is a fundamentally, if you talk about this in sort of sexual energies terms, it's a fundamentally masturbatory cultural force. It's an inwardly directed, inwardly fulfilling sort of philosophy that is motivated more or less by pleasure, by comfort, by um, risk aversion, and all of these things are incompatible with the sort of traditional understanding of space as a mythic template. So then what you have is you have modern science fiction, which has um, all the sort of social concerns of the modern progressive movement, and you have it bolted onto the sort of the old framework of of space science fiction, and you wonder why it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because there's this disjointing between the cultural desires of like the cultural impetus that the characters manifest, and the sort of desire and message of the setting and the author, as opposed to the mythic superstructure that the story is inhabiting. And there's this kind of mishmash. It's like the story, the narrative, and the meta narrative are clanking, like it's gears clanking. They're going in opposite directions. And so I don't think it's just me being a stodgy old conservative where I see, like, people who are super concerned with their gay polyamorous relationships on the spaceship. It's just that people who are involved in that kind of, I mean, let's be honest, this is not just like a different, this is not like a different choice, right? Is it's not, well, some people are heterosexual and some people are this way. It's more about, there's a certain kind of person who is who is directed into themselves, and that kind of person is not compatible with a traditional sort of heteronormative understanding of the sexes. So when you have those sort of people brought to the forefront, even when you have environments and individuals, especially, that are obviously trying to manifest the kind of modern, sterile sort of ideal of human sexuality, and you have that all juxtaposed with space as I've described, as this mythic superstructure, which is fundamentally, I think, virile, and about procreation and expansion, and uh, what you end up with is people who feel like don't belong. Like, culturally speaking, these people should not be in space, because they just don't seem like the kind of people that would naturally be drawn to this kind of lifestyle. It's just like in Western movies, all the sort of soft cosmopolitan people are all they're always from New York or east of the Mississippi, right? They're from sort of posh, ordered, well settled areas of the world, and all the rough and tumble people that live out west in the wilderness are these sort of naturally conservative, rugged individual types. Sorry, rugged types that, and especially in the form of these cowboy protagonists, a lot of times they are literally um, manifesting this sort of virile masculine drive in the context of the pioneer setting. Okay, so that's sort of my take on the descent of science fiction. Why science fiction, is specifically space science fiction, in the modern period is having such a hard time grasping, um, you know, gra- coming to terms with what their setting actually entails in a meta narrative frame, and then making the narrative fit the frame. It's the kind of stories that are being told more often than not are not the kinds of stories that would naturally find themselves in this world, so to speak. Um, and there are other ways to conceive of space, but none of them really lend themselves to the kinds of narratives that progressivism wants to tell. Because, as I've said, it's a kind of inwardly directed philosophy, and space is all outward. It's all extension, to to borrow from general relativity, right? Space is always extending, and so the attitude of characters and forces in space, if you're using space as this mythic narrative framework, are always extensional. And you can do this differently than the pioneer myth. You can, for example, I think the just in a talking about the the sort of narrative structure of the setting, right? Um, the Warhammer 40K setting, it makes a lot of sense because not only do we conceive of space as this sort of pioneer wilderness sort of thing, that's an American conception, but there's also like the existential conception of space uh, as a truly malign, like malevolent force, almost like this is the primordial darkness out of which monsters come. And that's why like the 40K setting makes a lot of sense, because people are naturally afraid of like dark, creepy, powerful forces out in the universe. And that's also what space is, right? There's all kinds of weird things in space, like the concept of a black hole, for example, which is a real thing, is also mythologically speaking like very terrifying. It's and it like eats worlds and stars, and you know, so you can understand how there are different mythic frames that you can put on space, but one that's compatible with progressivism, I doubt exists. So. Your luxury automated gay space communism will probably end up just being luxury automated gay communism, because the real impetus to go out into space does not exist in these sort of inwardly directed cultural paradigms. And that's what I'll leave you guys with today. I hope you have a good rest of the day. God bless, and good luck.